everyone, my name is TviTournaments, and today we are going to be discussing the current tournament that we are hosting on TviTournaments called the Duo-Type Redux Tournament. You are required to bring 2 Pokemon types out of the 18 possibilities to your teams, and these 2 types were randomly assigned by a randomized wheel that was chosen by the community as the best option to assign typing. One of the Pokemon on the team, the Ace Pokemon, had to share both of these typings, so whichever the 2 types that the wheel span, the Ace Pokemon had to be on there. These battles are going to be doubles 4v4, best of 3, Terastallization is allowed, but the Terastallization option has to be one of your typings. Pokemon is set to level 50, there are no duplicate Pokemon, no duplicate held items, there are no restrictions to the egg moves or the tutor moves, and the IVs, EVs or natures. The only Pokemon that we really banned were the Ruined Pokemon, the Paradox Pokemon and the Legendary Pokemon. Tatsugiri's commander ability was not allowed to be used because we wanted people to have freedom building their teams. What we're going to be going over today is basically the 4 groups, Group A, B, C and D, that you can see on this screen. And we're going to be going over the trainer cards that the trainers have. So these trainer cards will show us which Pokemon they have on their teams, and they'll show us what kind of angle they're going for in terms of team building. I'll be going over them teams on Maryland and seeing their defensive capabilities. So for the Duo-Type Redux tournament, the typings are as followed. There were 18 fighting types, 17 flying types, 15 ghost types, 13 grass types, 13 normal types, 13 dark types, 11 dragon types, 11 steel types, 10 fire types, 9 electric types, 9 psychic types, 9 fairy types, 8 water types, 8 rock types, 6 poison types, 4 ice types, and 1 of bug and ground typing. The duplicate Pokemon that were in this tournament were Annihilate and Pawmot with 4, Amoonguss, Arboliva, Dragonite, Goldengo, Indeedee, Meowscarada, Rotom, Tinkaton, Tyranitar with 3 each, Armarouge, Cyclizar, Flamigo, Gengar, Hydreigon, Lucario, Lycanroc, Murkrow and Scourge with 2. These are the noticeable unchosen Pokemon. So Bug we have Lokix, Volcarona, Duck we have Crocodile, Spiritomb, Dragon is Dragalge, Salamence, Electric is Rotom, Heat and Toxtricity, Fairy is Gardevoir and Klefki, Fighting is Hawlucha and Toxicroak, Fire is Houndoom and Slazzle, Flying is Drifblim and Gyarados, Ghost is Frostlass, Sableye, Grass is Appletun and Scovillain, Ground is Garchomp and Palisand, Ice is Abomasnow and Frostmoth, Normal is Braviary and Grafaiai, Poison is Clodsire and Quillfish, Psychic is Oranguru and Slowbro, Rock is Colossal and Lycanroc Midnight, Steel is Revavroom and Scizor, and Water is Gastrodon and Toxapex. These were just Pokemon that I believed I would be seeing in this tournament, or that I felt would have some sort of value on a person's team, but they just didn't make it in the top cuts of the trainer options in the end. Trivia for these Pokemon that were chosen: 12 out of the 96 were not dual types, so they remained monotyping. 17 of the 96 do not evolve. 36 out of 96 are from a 2-stage line. 43 out of 96 are 3rd stages of a 3-stage line. 10 pseudo legendaries were chosen. So there were Dragonites, there was Baxcalibur, there was Dragapult, there was a Dragon. All available regional birds were chosen. So there was Corviknight, there was Talonflame, there was Kilowattrel, and there was Staraptor. All 3 Paldean Pokemon final stages were chosen, so they were Meowscarada, Scourge, and Quaquaval. 2 out of 8 evolutions were chosen, so they were Flareon and Sylveon. 3 out of 6 Rotom forms were chosen, which was Rotom Wash, Rotom Mow, and Rotom Fan. Dusk form and Midday Lycanroc were chosen, but Midnight Lycanroc was not chosen. Dondozo and Tatsugiri were chosen by one of our people in the tournament. They were the one that initially said that Commander should be banned in order for more fairness, only for them to then get Dondozo Tatsugiri, which I find quite humorous. Generation 1 saw 7 Pokemon, Generation 2 saw 7 Pokemon as well, Generation 3 had 4 Pokemon, Generation 4 had 11 Pokemon, Generation 5 had 5 Pokemon, Generation 6 had 4 Pokemon, Generation 7 had 6 Pokemon, Generation 8 had 8 Pokemon, and Generation 9 had a grand total of 44 Pokemon. Now, from the previous tournament, from our Tournament 1, 19 Pokemon have made a return to this Tournament 2, whereas 5 Pokemon that were in Tournament 1 have not made a return. Additionally, out of all the Generation 9 Pokemon, there are still 15 yet to make a debut to TviTournaments, which will be quite interesting to see if we'll see those in Tournament 3 onwards. Facts about each of the trainers' teams. So the Phantom Pixies were the most immunities of 13. Air Forts had the most unique teams of 5 individual standouts. So out of their whole team, only 1 Pokemon was a duplicate. Obsidian Wings has the most times for weaknesses of 4. Spooky Dragons, every single Pokemon within that team either counters themselves or counters the other Pokemon within that same team. Rock Solid Rapids has the most gimmick representation. So on this team, there is a Tyranitar, which obviously has a Mega in Generation 6. It has a Lycanroc, which has an exclusive Z move from Generation 7. It has a Dreadnought, which has a Gigantamax form in Generation 8. And it has Dondozo Tatsugiri, which is arguably one of the most gimmicky kind of synergies that we've seen in Generation 9. Brain Damage have the most branch evolution / form changes in 4. Sub-Zero Slammers, within that team, they have the most common typing, which I mentioned above, fighting with 18, and the least common typing of 4. Nature Normies has the most usage of newer Pokemon, or as I like to call it, the new school team. So this team has a lot of Generation 9 Pokemon, and the rest of the Pokemon are probably from Gen 5 onwards. Opposite to that, we have the Acute Stressors, which have the most older range of Pokemon, which I like to call the old school team. You basically have Pokemon that aren't really heavy on Generation 9, but they stick back to Generation 1 and around that sort of area. Thunderburbs have the most Pokemon that do not evolve. Landfill tied for the most monotype Pokemon used. AC/DC are tied for the most used typings, which is 7. Robin Hood and his Merry Men, we have the most stage 3 Pokemon being 5. Pyromaniac have the record for the tallest Pokemon and the shortest Pokemon. CM Punk had the most stage 2 Pokemon being 4. And finally, Yuri Geller's Melted Spoons have the most shiny Pokemon of 6. Going off of the stats, we see the highest amount of base stat total and the lowest stat total, which I'll go over. Obsidian Wings has the highest if all 6 Pokemon combined their base stat totals of 3,224. And as we go down, we see it drops to 3,215, 3,214, 3,178, 3,151, 3,122, 3,076, 3,065, 3,062, 3,023, 3,017, 2,991, 2,950, 2,938, 2,913, and finally 2,912. So the highest base stat total is Obsidian Wings of 3,224. The highest HP stat is recorded by CM Punk at 578. The highest attack stat of 727 is the Sub-Zero Slammers. The highest defense stat total is from AC/DC of 584. The highest special attack stat of 634 combined is from Pyromaniacs. The highest special defense stat of 596 is recorded by the Phantom Pixies. And finally, we have the highest speed combination of 606 from the Spooky Dragons. In this tournament, Tournament 2, there were a grand total of 16 participants, split into groups of 4. There's Group A, a Group B, a Group C, and a Group D. So these are the 4 groups. Good luck to all trainers taking part. Group A consists of Wizzy, Sarah, Kezias, Amadoulis. Group B consists of Jay Sharona, Dashan, Kieran Johnson, and myself. Group C consists of Javo, Ultra Slowking, Spidermark, and Zeke. And Group D consists of Dingly Dong, Nico, Paul, and Mosbert. Points will be rewarded for victories as well as losses. By this counter down below, we can see that 4 points will be earned for those that get a 2-0 win. 3 points will be earned for a 2-1 win. 2 points will be rewarded for a 1-2 loss. And you'll still get a point even if you lose both of your games. These 4 groups are going to be facing each other in their groups to get as many points as possible. And what will happen is the top 2 from each group will advance into a winner's bracket, whereas the bottom 2 will advance into a redemption bracket. Those in the winner's bracket will advance through straight knockouts until a winner is decided, whereas the trainers in the redemption bracket will also fight straight knockouts in order to get the winner's achievement in the redemption bracket. And what will happen is the winner of both tables, the winners and the redemptions, will face against each other to see if redemption can be claimed. So Group A, big shout out to Amadoulis. He was the winner of Tournament 1. His team is the Obsidian Wings, and he has the Flying and Dark typing, and already I can see Dark being a good counter to these 2 Ghost typings here. However, there's also this Fairy typing here from Sarah that can quite easily counter these Dark types. In terms of Kezias' team, Ghost and Dragon, again, Fairy's going to be very nice on this Dragon typing, and the Ghost is going to be nice against Ghost. However, Ghost also counters these Ghost typings nicely. And finally, we have Wizzy. Wizzy's bringing in Steel type, which does really nice against this Fairy typing here. It also does nice resistance to this flying here and resists the dragon types from here. If I had to guess at which two would advance towards the winners bracket out of these four, I'd definitely say Amadoulis, because their performance in Tournament 1 was really good. They won it and they were able to show a really good performance. And just having that dark typing here gives a nice counter to these ghost typings already, which puts them at a good advantage. And if I had to pick another winner, I'd probably say Sarah, because her fairy types counter these two down here of Dark and Dragon, as well as her ghost putting some good work against these ghosts here. Group B has Jay Sharona, Dashan, Kieran Johnson and myself, and these typings are quite nice because they kind of complement / hinder each other quite nicely. So we have Jake with his rock and water typings. So unfortunately the rock isn't going to be doing nice against these two fighting types, and the water is not going to be doing nice against this grass typing here. The rock typing will resist the normal type moves coming from this normal here, and it will be able to be doing super effective damage to this ice typing down here. Dashin has grass and normal, and grass does really nice against this rock and water here. Unfortunately, having a normal type means that you're put at a disadvantage against these two fighting types that are here. Kieran Johnson has ice and fighting, so ice does really well against this grass typing here, and fighting does well against this rock and normal typing here. Unfortunately, it doesn't do well against either of these typings because psychic counters fighting really nicely and fighting counters ice really nicely. If I had to choose a top two and a bottom two, I'd place myself as one of them two, because I have the advantage against this fighting and ice here with my two typings. My fighting also does nice against this normal and rock here, and as long as I can work out a way to counter this grass and water typing, I should be okay. And if I had to pick another person to advance, I'd probably pick Jay Sharona, because he's performed really nicely over the years, and as long as he can look out for this fighting weakness, and as long as he can look out for this grass weakness, which I imagine he will, he should be able to take a good lead and just get on. Group C, we have Jarvo, Ultra Slow King, Spidermark and Zeke, and it looks like a very interesting combination of typings because they just have nice interactions with each other. So we have Jarvo with fighting and flying. Fighting does really well against this rock and this steel here. Jarvo has fighting and flying, which interacts quite interestingly with this table, because even though the fighting does well against the rock and the steel types, it has to look out for these two electric types with its flying typings. Ultra Slow King is put at a disadvantage because steel is here, which counters rock, and the poison type moves will not do anything to the steel types. And with the fighting type here again, I mentioned rock is weak to fighting. Spidermark, he came second in the previous tournaments. I imagine he'd be able to hold his own as long as he looks out for the rock types from Ultra Slow King, and as long as he kind of is weary of the other electric type user. And speaking of, we have Zeke with electric and steel. His electric typing does really nice against these two flying types, and his steel type is really good against poison and rock. He just has to look out for this fight from Java. If I had to pick two winners, I'd probably go for Zeke and Mark, because Zeke and Mark are two really powerful trainers, and they just, fortunately for them, have the advantage against these two trainers with their typings. Group D has Grass and Dark with Dingy Dong, it has Nico's Fighting and Grass types, it has Paul's Normal and Fire typings, and it has Mosbert's Psychic and Fairy typings. Now this is an interesting table because we have the Dark typing here, which counters Psychic really nicely, but doesn't do Fairy all that well. And fighting here does not do it any justice because Dark is obviously weak to fighting. The same with Grass and Fire from Paul. So Dingy Dong is put at a big disadvantage against all three of these teams, unfortunately. And moving on to the other three teams, we have Nico with Fighting and Grass, which again, Nico is put at a disadvantage again with these Psychic and Fairy typings. It also is put at a disadvantage with this Fire typing from Paul. Paul has a decent advantage because, like I mentioned, Fire does well against these two Grass typings, and he can probably hold his own against the two Psychic and Fairy types. And finally we have Mosbert, Psychic and Fairy. It's going to be a 50-50 in terms of countering that Dark type, and it does really well against this fighting here because Psychic and Fairy obviously counter both of those. If I was to pick, Mosbert would definitely be one of the two that I'd select as having the best advantage, and the other person I'd probably say is Paul, because Paul has the Fire typing which counters the two Grass types here, and if he can play his cards right and get the advantage on Mosbert, all he has to take care of is his weakness to fighting from the normal typing. So here we are in Maryland. Thank you very much, Sarah. Shout outs to you for doing each of the trainer cards. They look absolutely amazing. And thank you to Mark for putting them into a nice categorized list of 4. So this is Group A at the moment. We're going over each trainer's team. So this is Sarah's team. Sarah's gone for Mimikyu, Goldengo, Scaladurge, Sylveon, Tinkaton, and Annihilate. Now, even though she's got Fairy and Ghost, she has the advantage of having a Steel type from Tinkaton and Goldengo. She has Fighting and Fire as well. And looking at her opponents, she's got Steel types to look out for here, which her Fire type could do nicely, her Fighting type could do nicely. And then she's also got the likes of Meowscarada, which is weak to Fire down here, and Fighting. Tyranitar's weak to Fighting as well. And yeah, I can see her doing a lot of damage to the Obsidian Rings and Air Forts. And even her name, the Phantom Pixies, was a very nice touch, by the way. Defensively, I mentioned before, she has 13 immunities, so normal, fighting, poison, and dragon is not going to touch her. She does have 2 weaknesses to fire, but then again, she can just counter that with her fire type here. And she has 2 dark weaknesses and 2 steel weaknesses. Luckily though, the 2 dark weaknesses can be countered by her fairy types and her Annihilate's fighting moves. And then the steel types can be countered by Scaladurge's fire moves as well as Annihilate's fighting type moves. So the only 2 she really needs to look out for is Ground and Ghost, which has 3 and 4 weaknesses respectively. Ground is going to be a bit of an issue. Maybe she has an air balloon, and the other weakness she has is Ghost, but then again Ghost counters Ghosts, so she'll be able to take those weaknesses into strengths and just kind of return the damage. If I had to rank this team out of 10, I'd give it a solid 9 out of 10, purely because there's barely any weaknesses besides Ghost and Ground I mentioned. And yeah, she's just got a lot of resistances that make her team very solid. And just looking at the strategies, you've got Mimikyu with its Disguise, which is really nice because she can set up or she can do damage. She got Goldengo, which is making a very big climb in VGC, and it has just amazing stats and movesets. She's got Scaladurge, which provides fire for her team, which counters the steel types and counters the grass types that the other Pokemon the other trainers will be using. She's got Steel from Tinkaton, and she's got Annihilate with the fighting, which will be able to add nice type coverages for the other Pokemon. And yeah, just she has a very good chance of topping at least 1 or 2 of these trainers with her typings alone. Casius might cause her issues with his ghost types, but time will tell, time will tell. Going over to Wizzy's team now, the Air Forts. It was very surprising to see Squawkabilly make an entrance in this tournament because I did not feel Squawkabilly had the kind of stats to help it out. It has decent abilities with Intimidate, and so does Staraptor. If Wizzy went down that route, maybe he wants to double intimidate the opponents so that he has to worry about special attack only. He's also gone for things like Fortress, which he opted over Scizor. Maybe he wants to build it a bit more bulky and help out with things like Corviknight and Bronzong. And then maybe he's got Goldengo and Staraptor as his all-out attackers. Looking at the chart now, we can see 4 weaknesses to fire. 1 is Quad from Fortress. Maybe the Terrestrialization options can help. Maybe Fortress can Terrestrialize into a flying type just to avoid having that fire weakness. There's also 3 electric weaknesses from the 3 flying types, which can't be countered by any of these resistances here. Besides those big weaknesses, there's only Ice weakness, but then that gets resisted. There's only Rock weakness, but then that gets resisted. 2 Ghost weaknesses, but then they get 2 immunities that will help with that, as well as 2 Dark weaknesses, but maybe a Terrestrialization can help with those. Defensively, Wizzy's looking very, very nice. He's got Poison and Ground immunities. There's a couple of Ghost ones here and Fighting here. And yeah, it just looks like a very nice team. Defensively, Wizzy's looking really nice. He's only really got to worry about Fire and Electric. Fire coming from the Scaladurge, the Talonflame, and the Ceruledge. Maybe Kilowatch will have an electric type move that can counter the flying types. And yeah, we'll just have to see how the Air Fort does, because defensively it's looking very nice. If I had to rank it out of 10, it'd be an 8 out of 10. There are some very good defensive options here. Changing Bronzong's ability to heat proof now makes it 3 weaknesses to fire as opposed to the 4. So maybe Bronzong's got heat proof instead, which means that there's a bit more defensive coverage there. I'm gonna do this with the Obsidian Wings being flying and dark. Defensively, looking at it, it's not looking the greatest. I can see a lot of 4s and 3s. He did make the cut for the most amount of times for weaknesses, and as we can see, Tyranitar's quad weak to Fighting, Meowscarada's quad weak to Bug, Talonflame's quad weak to Rock, and Hydreigon's quad weak to Fairy. Other areas of interest, I mean, there is 2 water and electric weaknesses here. However, with an immunity here, if it does have Volt Absorb, and 2 resistances here, as well as the 3 resistance, no, as well as the 2 resistances to water here, it's looking average for this team. Just got to look out for these ice moves, these fighting moves, these bug, rock, and fairy moves. Which, if we look at the opponents, like I mentioned, Sarah with her fairy types would put his team in a bit of danger. I know that Meowscrader could have proteins, change of typing. Tyranitar can translate into a flying type to get out of there and avoid this type's weakness. Talonflame can set up Tailwind with Kilowattrel there as well. And it was surprising to see Honchkrow as opposed to Murkrow. I know it says Murkrow on here, but he has actually gone for Honchkrow. And depending on how Honchkrow fares in this tournament, could be the difference between a win and a loss. If I was going to give this team ranking, maybe I'll do 7.5 out of 10 to be fair. Purely because there's just too many weaknesses. There's a few ice weaknesses, especially in fairy weaknesses. Luckily he didn't go up against ice. But if he had, then it'd cause him just big issues. Moving on to the Spooky Dragons, which is run by Kezias. It's quite nice to see that there's a lot of immunities in fighting normal, and there's a nice ghost immunity here and a ground immunity here. But unfortunately, it doesn't hide the fact that there's a lot of weaknesses to ice, there's a lot of weaknesses to ghost, dragon, dark, and fairy. You can kind of get around this ice weakness, I suppose, if you have the correct terrors, or maybe if you switch into the right Pokemon. You can try and get around these weaknesses with maybe berries or items that reduce that damage. Maybe you can put yourself behind a reflector or a light screen. In terms of it being able to counter the opposing Pokemon, obviously Sarah and Kezias are going to have a showdown because they both have ghost types. The fire type in Ceruledge will be nice against these steel types that Airthought is carrying, as well as maybe Cyclozard doing a nice shed tail to get out of there. This team I'm going to give an 8 out of 10 purely because I know how powerful ghost and dragon types do on their own. I will try to ignore the fact that there are a lot of weaknesses with the fact that there are a lot of resistances. Maybe if they can play their cards right, they'll be able to really make most of their teams. Moving on to the Rock Solid Rapids, which is Jake's team. Jake has the water and rock typing, and already I kind of know roughly what he's kind of doing. He's got a Dreadnought that could possibly have Swift Swim, which he's paired nicely with Pelipper to get that drizzle going to make it rain. And then he's got Tyranitar down here, which will probably have Sandstream to set up Sandstorm, which will give Dreadnought and Lycanroc a nice special defense boost. So it's got quite nice synergy, which I will get some points when the ranking at the end. Defensively, Jake's got a few big weaknesses in electric, grass, fighting, and grounds. It's quite unfortunate to see that such a good team with amazing synergy just falls flat when it comes to weaknesses. There's 3 fighting weaknesses, which again Pelipper can kind of counter. 3 ground weaknesses, which nothing but Pelipper again can counter. So with good synergy and a decent spread of abilities and kind of the stats overall, I'd probably put this team at a solid 8.5 out of 10. Purely because I could ignore the grass weaknesses because it's got Pelipper, because I can see that there's not really any other weaknesses except for the Steel and Fairy, but then water can kind of counter that. At the moment, looking at the other teams, Dashin's got grass types, which Jake is not liking. There's also these fighting types here, which Kieran Johnson's bringing, which is not looking nice for his team. I've got my own fighting types as well. He's just got to really watch himself in this tournament. So this is my team, the brain damage team, consisting of fighting and psychic types. And defensively, I've just got to worry about ground types really, but then everything else is just a 2 weakness or below. Maybe I have to worry about the flying types, but then I've got Hormot with electric moves possibly. I've got to worry about the psychic types, but then I've got 2 resistances there. I've got to worry about Ghost, Dark, and Fairy, but then they've each got their own resistances that can kind of counter those. Looking at my opponents, I've got Armarouge, which is Fire, which can counter the grass types on Dashin's team. With Jake having Rock and Water, I can counter those with my fighting types, but I will have to look out for the water types with Armarouge and Tauros. And then with Kieran Johnson, like I mentioned before, my psychic types can counter his fighting types, except maybe Weavile, and my fighting types can counter all his ice types, except for maybe Annihilate. So overall, I'd probably give this team an 8 out of 10. It does really well defensively, as long as I don't have to worry about ground types. Kieran Johnson's team with the Sub-Zero Slammers. For his last team, I gave it a 9 out of 10. For this team, I'm definitely going to have to give it lower ranking, purely because there's a lot of fighting weaknesses, there's a lot of fairy weaknesses, and then there's flying, psychic, rock, and steel, which doesn't really help this team. And even if I could talk about the resistances, you've still got only what 3 here, and then a big one of ice of 4. So yeah, unfortunately, you do have this immunity to fighting, but with 4 here that are weak to fighting, you've just got to really look out for things like my fighting types and any fighting moves that these 2 bring. You also got to worry about things like psychic, which I'm bringing. You've got to worry about flying, which Jake has. You've got to worry about rock type moves that anyone could bring, especially Jake. and then you got to look out for any steel and fairy type moves. So overall, I'm going to have to give this team a 6 out of 10 because there's just too many defensive weaknesses and there's not enough resistances to kind of make up for it. The only resistances are water, which would be good for Jake's team, ice, bug, and dark, which no one is really bringing. Your typings don't really help you in that matter, and your trustalization options don't really help you either. The team composition is looking nice, but you've got 6 physical attackers and you haven't got any special attackers, you haven't got anything like a wall, you haven't got anything set up. You might do, I'm just basing this off of what I see. I see a lot of physical offense but not special offense or kind of walls. So yeah, unfortunately I'm going to have to give this team a 6 out of 10 for those factors. Finally, for Group B, we have Nature's Normies with Dashin. Defensively, it's looking kind of bad as well. We've got 3 fire weaknesses, 4 ice weaknesses, 4 fighting weaknesses, 3 flying weaknesses, and 3 bug weaknesses. There are a couple of resistances to water, electric, and grass, which will help out with Jake's team quite nicely. But unfortunately, you've got to think he's going up against Kieran Johnson, which has ice and fighting, which he's not going to be doing anything against. And he's going to be going against myself, which is fighting and psychic, which psychic is quite nice, but then it's going to be very big trouble with the fighting type options. I do like the team composition though, because there is Bolivia, which can set up grassy terrain. There is Indeedia, which can set up psychic terrain. You've got the ability to redirect with things like Follow Me from Mousehold and Rage Powder with Amoongus. Cyclizar can possibly set up a Shed Tail and give a substitute to another Pokemon. So I'm going to give this team a 7.5 out of 10. There's some nice options with physical attack and special attack. You've got fairly decent things like redirect, you've got things that maybe even Trick Room. Unfortunately, you've just got a lot of weaknesses that kind of hold you down, especially if those weaknesses include fighting, which me and Kieran Johnson will bring in. And you have got the resistances to Jake's water types, but unfortunately he might be using rock type moves on you to do neutral damage. Moving on to Group C, we start off with Shiny Man Javo with his acute stresses. Defensively, he's only got 3 really big weaknesses in ice, rock, and fairy, which is quite nice to see. He isn't going to be going up against any ice types from what I can see. He's not going to be going up against any fairy types from what I can see, except for maybe this Tinkaton down here. Unfortunately, however, he has got 3 rock weaknesses, which Landfill will be bringing, but he has also got the fighting types in his team to kind of counter those, which means that I think Javo's got quite a nice team in terms of type coverages. Like I mentioned before, looking at the other teams of Group C, we have got Landfill, which Javo can counter quite nicely. The fighting types will do nice against the rock types, and as long as the flying types look out for the rock type moves, he should be okay. However, he has got Noivern, Rotom, and Dragonite as 3 of the flying types, which means that it's only really Flamigo that's weak to electric. So Javo actually has a really good advantage against his opponents, as well as being able to counter the steel types with his fighting types, and being able to counter the flying types with maybe things like Rotom's electric type moves, or maybe Annihilate's got some sort of rock type move hidden up its sleeve. So Javo, you're going to be getting a solid 9 out of 10. Yeah, you have got a few weaknesses in ice, rock, and fairy. However, you're not going to be going up against ice and fairy types, except for Tinkaton. And you have got to worry about the rock typing, but luckily your fighting types counter that. Also, your trustalization options are fighting and flying, which helps out Lucario quite nicely because it gets rid of that fighting weakness. If any of these flying types were to trustlize into a fighting type, then they would get a resistance to rock. And yeah, just defensively and offensively, this team is looking very, very nice. Moving on to the runner-up from the previous tournament, Spidermark 86 team of Thunderburbs. We've got Fly and Electric representatives, which unfortunately give it 5 weaknesses to Ice, which is not nice, as well as 3 weaknesses to Rock and 4 weaknesses to Fairy. He's going to be having things like Tailwind Murkrow possibly, he's going to be having things like Revival Blessings Formats, and then Oricorio's ability with Dancer will be able to copy things like Dragonite's Dragon Dance or Flamigo's Co-Star might be able to help get them stat boosts as well. So I'm going to be giving this team a really nice 8.5 out of 10. It would be a 9 out of 10, but it's just a case of some of these Pokemon might be able to get 1 hit or possibly even 2 hits. You got to think, if Murkrow doesn't have an Eevee like that, thing's going to die. Pawmot is known for its kind of flimsiness, so that could go down quite easily. Oricorio, I imagine that its defenses aren't the greatest, and 1 or 2 hits would take that one down. And then things like Dragonite having a quad weak to Ice. If any of these other 3 bring a really strong Ice type move, then it's going to be a KO to Dragonite. Moving on to Landfill now, which is run by Ultra Slowking. Not looking really good, and unfortunately the wheel kinda did screw you over big time, buddy, because you've got a lot of weaknesses to water, grass, fighting, ground, psychic, and steel. You're not going to be worried too much about the electric types that the opponents will be bringing. You will have to worry, however, about the steel types that AC/DC is going to be bringing. Any of these teams could have ground type moves that can jeopardize your team quite badly. And then obviously fighting here, which is what acute stresses and thunderbirds will be bringing. Your defensive options or kind of defensive counters to that would be probably Among Us using things like Rage Powder. You have got Garganackle, which is known for a brick wall to be able to take in a few hits. Trying to accept the Sandstorm possibly to give you a nice special defense boost, but then besides that, you kind of stuck. Let's give you a 6.5 out of 10 purely because the defensiveness is not looking too nice. You've got 6 blaring weaknesses. You have got a few kind of glass cannons, but then you kind of also want to have bulk in your team, which unfortunately your only best options are going to be weak to a lot of things. Moving on to Zeke crates now with AC/DC. Steel is obviously a very nice defensive coverage, which kind of gives it bias towards the ranking at the end. And electric again is only really weak to ground, so it's just really nice defensive typing. So having those two paired together does give it the ground weakness, which is countered by Rotom's levitate ability. There's no real ground types here that can cause you any issues. Maybe these rock types have ground type moves, and the only other weakness really would be fire, but then Rotom puts out fire with its water type moves, and maybe some of these Pokemon have rock type moves. Looking at the rest of the table, you're looking very nice in resistances. These nice greens showing up quite nicely with 5s and 4s. And offensively, you've got things like heavy hitting King Gambit, you've got heavy hitting Magnezone, you've got support with things like Tinkaton and Goldengo, and possibly even Pawmot. And yeah, you've just got a lot of good options in terms of offense, defense, maybe some status moves coming in from Rotom with Will-O-Wisp and stuff. And looking at your opponents, you got the flying types that can get hit for super effective damage with the electric types. The rock types on landfill aren't going to like your steel type moves too much, and it's just going to be a case of unfortunate type matchups. Overall, this team, I'd give it a solid 9 out of 10. It's very nice defensively. You've only got to really worry about ground and fire, but then there's no fire types that I can see, and there's no real ground types that I can see either, so you're pretty good. Group D has Dingy Dong's Robin Hood and the Merry Men's, and looking at it from a defensive standpoint, there are a lot of weaknesses. You've got 3 fire weaknesses, 5 ice weaknesses, you've got 3 fighting weaknesses, 4 poison weaknesses, 3 flying weaknesses, 4 bug weaknesses, and 4 fairy weaknesses. But it's just not looking nice in terms of the defensive standpoint. You do have the nice resistances to water, electric, and grass, which will help you with things like Nico's grass types, help you with things like Arbolivia's grass typing here. But besides that, you're going to be getting hit by a lot of these very nice super effective hit stuff. The only saving grace is obviously your water immunities to Psychic, which will help with Mosbert's, Urigella's, Melted Spoons. But then again, he's got fairy types which can counter 4 of these Pokemon, especially Hydreigon. In terms of your team as well, you have got things like Grimmsnarl which can set up screens, you've got things like Murkrow that can set up Tailwinds. You can possibly get support with Arboliva, maybe setting up Light Screen and maybe setting up grassy terrain. Serena's got Queen Majesty, which can help you with priority moves, so if you're worried about things like Breloom using Muck Punch, then that can help you out there. This team's ranking is going to be 7.5 out of 10. It's not very nice on the defensive side, however it makes up for that just slightly with the access to things like screens, tailwinds, and just causing chaos with things like Levitate and Queen's Majesty. Paul's team of the Pyromaniacs, looking at the defensive standpoint, it's not as bad as the other teams. You have got to worry about the water, ground and rock types. However, as we've mentioned before, there's no real ground types except for the one Toad School down here. But then again, you've got grass types here, which your fire types can counter quite nicely. The only other weaknesses are rock and water, which Azumarill will have water, but then you've got Arboliva for that, I guess. Also, if you set the sun up with Torque Hold and it halves this damage from water, so maybe let's not even consider water as a weakness because fire is going to be up 9 out of 10 times. Your team does really nice against Dingly Dong and Nico because they both have grass typings. You've also got things like Scaradurge with Ghost, which will do nice against the psychic types that Mosbert will be bringing. You've got things like the Sunshine that Torque Hold can provide to make your fire moves even stronger. And then Farigiraf, if it wanted to set up Trick Room, it will do well against Dingly Dong and Nico, but maybe not so much Mosbert. So overall, I'm going to give this team a 9 out of 10. It has very nice options in setting up Sunlight to get rid of this water weakness. There's no real ground threat except from Toad School, but then Toad School is also a grass type, which fire can counter. Not really worried about rock because none of these are rock types and none of them can really do decent rock damage. And CM Punk now is interesting because you've got things like Breloom and Pawmot, which are known as the glassy cannons that can do a lot of damage but not take the hits. But then you've also got things like Annihilate, Amoonguss and Hairy Armor, which can take a couple of hits and do just as much decent damage. So it'll just kind of be interesting to see how you kind of play around with that. Defensively though, you have got 2 huge weaknesses to Flying and Psychic, as well as 4 weaknesses to Fairy, which is unfortunate because there's a Fairy and Psychic trainer sitting right there in Mosbert. You've also got to consider things like this Fire weakness up here and this Ice weakness, but then I've put Hairy Armor as Thick Fat, so maybe that's the route you've kind of gone down to make sure you don't take as much damage with a switching. With this team you have access to things like Fake Out with Pawmot and Hairy Armor. You have got things like Mach Punch from Breloom and Pawmot. You've got Rage Power, which helps if you want to redirect certain moves. Toadstool also has the ability to use Spores to put Pokemon to sleep. So overall, I'm going to give this team an 8 out of 10. It's got some really nice offense. It's got pretty decent defense in terms of things like resistances, but you just got to look out for Mosbert and Paul's teams. If you can get yourself set up with things like Spore and Fake Outs and stuff, then I can see you doing quite a lot in this tournament. Last but not least, we have Urigella's Melted Spoons, which is Mosbert's team of Psychic and Fairy types. And looking at the groups, he's got a very nice advantage against the Dark and Fighting types. And as long as he can avoid damage from the Fire types that Paul will be using, with things like Dash Bun, having its ability to absorb fire, the ability to have Azumarill's Water typing help it out nicely, and even if Armarouge has Flash Fire, it will be able to absorb fire nicely. You've got 3 poison weaknesses here, which is unfortunate, but then you've got the immunity to Tinkaton, and everything else is just looking outstanding. You've got Dragon immunities, you've got Ghost immunity and Fire immunities. So Pyromaniacs might not cause you too many issues. The other thing to mention is that Indeedee will probably have Psychic Terrain, which will stop priority moves from things like Breloom and things like Dingly Dong's Sucker Punch from Meowscarader. You have access to things like Trick Room with Hatterene, Indeedee and Armarouge, which can help the slow Pokemon on your team out quite nicely. And then you've got things like Armarouge having Lava Plume, which is really nice with Dash Bun to increase its defenses as well as causing damage to the opponents. So yeah, fortunately for you Mosbert, you have a really nice matchup to the Dark types and the Fighting types. You have a really nice matchup against the Fire type moves that come your way because Dash Bun can absorb those, Armarouge can absorb them. You can probably outspeed them in Trick Room, or you can probably use not have Trick Room and still take advantage of things like a really slow Frigoraph or Talk Hole. And then with things like spread moves as well, you've got things like Indeedee and Hatterene using Dazzling Gleam, or you've got Armarouge using Expanding Force, you've got things like Tinkaton that uses Rock Slide. So overall, I would give this team a 10 out of 10, but I always see room for perfection. So I might have to slide it back down to 9.5 out of 10, purely because there's only 3 poison weaknesses which you won't have to worry about at all. You've got really nice coverages, you've got really nice synergy with all your team members, and you've not really got to worry about things like dragons, not got to worry about things like fire, and yeah, you just got a very, very nice team composition. I'm really glad that I can end the team on a 9.5 out of 10 because a lot of the other teams were having too many weaknesses, whereas this team has really taken into account things that can kind of make it well-rounded, especially with the abilities, the typings. You've got to worry about things like Ghost, Dark and Steel, but then again, your Dark types all get countered with Fairy, your Steel types, you've got Armarouge there. So good luck everyone in the tournament. I've gone over your trainer cards, I've gone over your team interactions with other players in the tournament. All your teams are looking very interesting, from the lowest of 6 out of 10s to the highest of 9s and 9.5s out of 10. It'll be really interesting to see how the abilities, how the movesets play into effects. Being 4v4 doubles is going to be quite interesting to see how that affects players. This tournament will go on for about a week or 2. The top 2 from each group will advance to the winners bracket, and the bottom 2 will advance to the redemption bracket. Points will be rewarded whether you win 2-0 or whether you lose 2-0. I'll be making future videos where I record my own gameplay. I might be able to record gameplay with other players in other groups if they want to get their videos on YouTube. If players from Group A, C and D wanted to battle me so that I could record it and put it on YouTube, feel free to ask. And I'd love to see how my Psychic and Fighting types fare against the other teams in the tournament. So that'll be it guys. I've been your host TviTournaments, and until next time, make sure you guys battle hard, make sure you team build to your best of your abilities, and I'll see you guys next time.